I'm going to talk about the attack against the brown indigenous community of this country. We are under attack by the recent policies and recent tweets of the white supremacist President Trump. As a historian, I have to give you a little bit more of a background behind the policies that are being enacted today. Let us remember that this entire continent was stolen from us, the indigenous people. And when I say us, the indigenous people, I'm talking about Native American, I'm talking about Mexican, Central American, South American, all of us that were persecuted and terrorized through violence, smallpox, biological warfare, slavery, terrorism for 5 centuries. So what you have now are different groups of indigenous populations that are categorized differently under the system of white supremacy. Let me explain. There are those of us that are constructed as Native Americans, right? And those of us are found in North America, in Canada, and all over this continent. Then there are those of us that are hidden under colonial terms like Hispanic, Latino, Raza, and Mestizo. These policies were established after the initial killing of 95% of our population as indigenous people. Those of us that were persecuted by the Spanish-speaking Europeans were under the control and occupation of Spanish and other Iberian invaders and settlers. So those of us that survived the initial genocide of 95% of our population are then forbidden to learn our language, our history, our knowledge, our traditions, anything having to do with indigenous history and culture. There's still some populations that have survived that were able to do it at the threat of persecution and public execution, and I have tons of receipts if you're interested in that. Then there's those of us that are uprooted, and through these forced mass relocations of our people, we end up detribalized, not knowing our nations, not knowing our origins, and being ripped off of our indigenous nations, right? Many of us are known today, grouped under Mexican, under the nationalities of El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala. So you have to understand that these constructions of nations came as the product of white supremacy, as a product of the independent efforts by Europeans. Once they established themselves here on this continent, they wanted to detach themselves from their motherland, which this part of the U.S. is considered, right, England, and then part of like Mexican, or what is known as Mexico, and other countries in Central America wanted to become independent from Spain and many of the Iberian, motherlands. So they're fighting for their independence as Europeans now governing and occupying indigenous lands while using indigenous labor, indigenous resources, indigenous soldiers to fight for those battles. Okay, fast forward 2019. What is the population? What are the categories? Well, myself, I am categorized, right, according to the U.S. government, as Mexican, right, as Hispanic, as Latina, but they cannot categorize me as such because that's not who I am. The Mexican construct, I understand it, it actually has rooted in Mexica, which is the indigenous civilization at the time of the Spanish invasion, but it's been hijacked and constructed into this national model through which the Spaniards were able to create a country to become independent from Spain. And Hispanic or Latina, which was a very recent creation in the 70s, that said that people that came from Latin America are Latinos. People that speak Spanish are Latinos or Hispanics. They can't even figure it out themselves. Well, let me explain to you, let me educate you a little bit on colonization and indigenous history. Latin is, I think it's already, they don't even speak it anymore. It's the Roman language right? Latin is a Roman language. Latin nowadays can be constructed as Southern Europeans, French, Italian, Portuguese. Those are Latinos, okay? In Europe, that part of Europe belongs to the Latin heritage, the Romans, all that, okay? Hispanic, they say, oh, you speak Spanish, you're Hispanic. Wow, what a basic, simple logic, right? Doesn't work. Doesn't work. I'm speaking English right now, so does that make me Britannic? Probably not. Does that make African Americans Britannic? Because most of them have English surnames and they predominantly speak English. Probably not, right? So with us, there's, oh, well, you're Hispanic. Let's put that to a test. Hispanic, when you look at Webster's dictionary and all of its variations, a Hispanic is a person or thing from Spain. You know who's Hispanic? Julio Iglesias is Hispanic. Enrique Iglesias is Hispanic. Antonio Banderas is Hispanic. Not us. We, as Mexican, Central American, South American people, are not the language through which we have been forced to speak for 5 centuries. We are not going to allow this colonial language, whether it is English or in Espanol, to define who we are. These are symptoms of colonization. These are symptoms of occupation. These are symptoms that came product of 500 years of genocide and occupation. Well, why don't you speak your native language? Many of us do. Many of us are also working in revitalization efforts to learn one or many of our indigenous languages. So that is part of our healing. Part of our healing is reconnecting ourselves to our identity, but also to our languages, which were uprooted from our communities. But back to the initial point of this video. The initial point of this video is to remind you that these efforts, right, to criminalize, to limit, to police indigenous bodies as constructed through these systems of white supremacy, known as Mexican, Central American. These are efforts to wipe out and commit ethnic cleansing on a population that they feel threatens the white model of racial hierarchies in this colonial country. It's really, really easy if you understand it that way, right? So we have the Indian Removal Act of 1830. So the Indian Removal Act was basically the U.S. government trying and forcing indigenous populations to move into federally recognized areas for our brothers and sisters known as Native Americans. So it was what would convenience white Americans where Native Americans should be placed. So it was a massive relocation of indigenous people, mind you, who've been living there for thousands of years, all of a sudden to appease these white settlers who were using force, biological warfare, and violence against our populations. So those of our brothers and sisters were terrorized into those movings, right, into those relocations. Then we have Operation Wetback, right, of the 50s. Operation Wetback was a policy that was the U.S. government working with the Mexican government. And again, let me remind you, Mexican government is not Mexican. It is Criollos, Spaniards controlling Mexico. And remember how I talked about they became independent from the Spanish crown, and therefore the elite, the leadership of Mexico has continued to keep that racial leadership of Spanish and other European descent folks that continue to run that country. So yes, it was an agreement between the U.S. Mexican government to police and to deport undocumented Mexican workers. Well, ultimately, this has been the greatest number of deportations in U.S. history, where they ended up deporting 1.3 million undocumented people, many of whom were actually U.S. citizens. So we're looking at now, in the 90s, we have this, there's always been anti-brown, anti-indigenous sentiments, but there was a resurgence of anti-brown, anti-indigenous sentiments in California, in particular with Proposition 187. Proposition 187 was an effort called Save Our State, an initiative that basically banned undocumented people and their children from receiving public services, which was education, clinics, healthcare, anything that had to do with public services. We were banned for. That initiative did pass by majority, and it was actually proven unconstitutional, right? And that was in 1994 or so, 1992, 94. And then we have now, in the early 2000s, a resurgence of Save Our State, right? An actual group of white supremacists that work very hard to terrorize and police illegal aliens, right? But we know who they're talking about. They're talking about me. They're talking about Mexicans. They're talking about Central Americans, South Americans. Those of us that are disrupting their white utopia. And so now you have this president that ran his campaign calling Mexican rapists, saying that there's some good people, being anti-Muslim, being anti-black, so many things, right? So now he's president. And what happens is he continues that because it gave him profits. It gave him profits as far as votes. It gave him a presidency. And so now he's revitalizing his efforts. He recently announced through his Twitter that he was going to start massively deporting our people starting today, Sunday, June 23rd. So I'm saying all this to remind everyone, because I think sometimes we get so caught up in the moment, right, of what's happening, that we forget that these are patterns and this is a product of a historical process. And to make you aware and to let you know that Mexicans, Central Americans, South Americans, the majority of us, we are still indigenous people. We are still here. We still have rights to this land, although we are being limited and we're being categorized into these colonial terms that identify us with Europe. And that makes sense if you're trying to keep indigenous people from reclaiming who they are. It makes a lot of sense if you identify them by factors that denote their colonized condition and connect them to Europe, instead of honoring their indigenous identity and history and heritage, which connects them to the land that you're occupying. That doesn't support your plan of white supremacy, right? Which is an ultimately white country. And so to those of my people that are watching this, and my people, I'm talking about Mexican, Central American, Native American, South American, to you, I say, keep strong. To you, I say, you're on your land. To you, I say, let's support our communities. Let's make sure that we are, if you have the resources, let's continue giving those resources. And to you, I say, stay strong. To you, I say, stand proud of who you are. Don't let colonization, don't let the scare tactics demoralize you and who you are and your work and what you're doing. Be strong. And those of you who are not indigenous of this continent and you support these policies of white supremacy that are being implemented by this white supremacist settler country, I want to ask you, do you know where Europe is? Do you know where Europeans come from? Do you know that Europeans mutated themselves into Americans and have used this nationalism of America to disconnect themselves from their motherland, because their motherland is Europe? And so let's continue to be honest about this. Let's add that awareness that us indigenous people, we are still here. And no matter what type of labels they use to try to drown us out and suffocate our existence, we're still here. And we are recovering from the genocide of 95% of our population. That 5% of us survived. Yeah, we're coming back. We're coming back in the millions because we are recovering our population. We are recovering our humanity. We are recovering our land. We are recovering our language. We are recovering who we are. And it's a beautiful thing. It feels amazing to know that every day that I wake up on my land, that I'm learning my language, that I know who I am, and that I'm not ashamed and will never be ashamed of being who I am, of my grandparents, of my great-great-grandparents, of my community, because we are ancient, we are connected to this land, and we belong here. We are Indigenous people, and we're coming back to what belongs to us. So the scare tactics, these policies, like I've mentioned before, let me remind you of the Indian Removal Act, of Operation Wetback, of these tactics of ethnic cleansing. And I want to welcome you to read the books American Holocaust by David E. Stannard. I want you to read the policies of genocide by the Geneva Convention. And you will also see that the forceful relocation of indigenous people or a group of people is also under the definition of genocide. So what we are looking at today, what we are experiencing, even though they're trying to normalize it with this institutional rhetoric and this lexicon of illegality, it's really boils down to genocide. No, genocide is not just the killing, which they continue to do. Our people are being killed on the border. Our people are dying at the border. Our people are being killed by negligence of the U.S. Border Patrol. It's also part of genocide. The sexual abuse that our children are suffering in these internment camps of the U.S., this is also genocide, right? So let's be honest about what is happening and let's call it for what it is. This is genocide. America, you continue your practice to this very day.